In this video, I'll show you how to take the simple bouncing ball animation that we created earlier and add squash and stretch to it. So here's a review of what we animated in part 1. And now we're going to go and add squash and stretch to this ball. So as you can see, this ball, as it moves through the space, bounces off the floor. In part 1, we spoke about how it changes speed. It starts out moving slowly, hits the ground fast, bounces off fast, slows down in midair, and so on. And also, when it hits the ground, there is some impact. So whenever a moving object that is soft hits another surface, we like to squash it to deform it and create that feeling of softness in the object. And as for stretch, when an object starts moving fast, we stretch it sort of as a way to smear it and make it look like it's moving so fast that it kind of blurred out or smeared out into a long streak. That's the whole reason we add stretch, and then we add squash when one object hits another. So in the case of a bouncing ball, when it starts slow, we're going to keep it round. No squash, no stretch. As it speeds up on approaching the ground, we'll stretch it. When it hits the ground, we squash it. And then when it bounces off fast, we stretch it again. And that cycle repeats. So in the case of a bouncing ball, we end up with something like this. We start with a round ball that stretches as it falls to the ground. You can see that. Then it squashes when it hits the ground. It stretches as it takes off, and then it returns to a round shape at the top of the bounce. And then we repeat that pattern. So in Maya, so far we've only animated the position of this ball. To animate the squash and stretch, we have to animate the rotation and the scale of this ball. So again, we're going to start with a round ball, and the rotation and scale have already been keyed when we animated the bouncing itself. So at frame 1, I don't do anything. At frame 5, just before the ball hits the ground, I'm going to do a couple things. 1, increase the length of this ball. 2, I'm going to rotate it so that it looks like it's stretching in the direction that it is traveling in. And 3, if I were to just keyframe this as it is, you would see that the ball actually gets bigger in size because I simply scaled it up on the y-axis. In other words, the volume of this ball at frame 5 is more than at frame 6. It just grew out of nowhere, and that doesn't look right, not even in cartoon physics. So every time we stretch the ball, every time we make it longer on the y-axis, we need to make it smaller on the z and x axes so that the volume of the ball stays consistent from frame to frame. So that when we go from frame 5 to frame 6, even though the shape of the ball changes, the volume will not. So at frame 5, I already scaled it up on the y-axis. I need to scale it down on the x and z axes, make it thinner so that it keeps the same volume, sort of like this. You see, even though we went from stretch to squash and back to a round shape, it still looks like it's the same ball. It hasn't gained any volume or lost any volume. It just changes its shape. So at frame 5, I'm going to scale down x and z together. And to do this, I'm going to grab this square that's in the xz plane, click and drag it. So notice that it uniformly scales the x and the z together. So I take it down a bit and then I keyframe this. And now I'm going to step back and forth from 5 to 6 and make sure that it looks believable that this is the same ball. I don't have to be too exact, but I want to make sure that it looks like it has roughly the same volume, which it does at this point. So I'm good with this. So that's my stretch key at frame 5. At frame 6, the ball has hit the ground, so I want to squash it. And to squash it, I'm going to scale it down on the y-axis. Again, I want to preserve its volume, so I want to make it fatter on the x and z axes. So I grab this square in the xz plane, scale it up. I'm going to set a key temporarily and compare the ball at frame 5 and frame 6. Okay, looks like I can scale it out a little bit more on the x and z. Yes, and that looks like it's preserving its volume well. Now the problem is, because I scaled the ball down on the y-axis, it's no longer touching the ground. So I need to make that adjustment. Simply move it down on the y-axis and key it again. So I have this ball that is stretching out as it speeds up and then squashing as it hits the ground. So this is my stretch, this is my squash. I gotta continue the same pattern for the remaining bounces. At frame 7, I want it to stretch again, but a little less because it lost some energy during the first impact with the ground. So once again, rotate it a little, scale it up on the y-axis, scale it down on the x and z, set a key, and there you have it. And then I continue the same pattern later. And now as I reach the last bounce, which really isn't a bounce, it's falling off the edge, I will stretch it and then as it falls off, I'll stretch it some more. So now let's see how this looks. So that's what it looks like after adding the squash and stretch. You notice it at once looks more rubbery, softer, squishier, A very different quality from the solid ball bounce that didn't change its shape. So depending on the material of the ball you are animating, you can choose to add more squash and stretch or less or none at all. It all depends on the kind of material you're using. But in general, you can see that the squash and stretch does make the ball feel more soft and the animation look more interesting because of all the shape changes that are happening. The one thing I would change is that the ball seems too eager to stretch as it's falling down. So to tweak this, you see that's too much of a stretch too early on. So around frame 3, I would like it to be a little less stretched. So to tweak this, I could go in and add more keyframes around at these in-between points, but I could also just tweak things in the graph editor. So let's try the graph editor. I'm going to look at the rotate and the scale keys. Let's just look at the scale keys first. So as you can see, it's almost a straight line from frame 1 to frame 5 as the ball starts to stretch out. So I'm going to adjust the tangents of these scale keys a little bit. Just like I did for the bouncing ball tangents, I'm going to make sure that this stretch starts slowly and then picks up. And you can see what change this is making. I went from this stretched out shape, and just watch what happens to the shape as I adjust these tangents. So it's a much more subtle stretch. I'm going to do the same for all of these stretch keys. The point is to try and keep it as close to 1 or as close to being round as possible around the frames when the ball is up high. For example, at frame 10, the ball is up high. So around frame 10, I want it to be as close to round as possible. Okay. And the same thing here. I don't want it to be stretched too much as it's flying through the air. So I'll adjust these. And let's take a look now. A much more gentle stretch as it falls through the air. It's not so distracting as before, but it still has the nice springy rubbery feel when it hits the ground. And that's the balance that we're looking for. So enjoy!